They said pride wasn't personal, but how would you feel if your own father opened the door on Christmas Eve, saw the brand new Chevy Silverado you'd bought just to make him smile, and said, "You think you can buy my love with that?" I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just stood there, snow falling between us, while he slammed the door in my face. The next morning, the police called about the same truck, and that was when I learned some gifts break more than they mend. I'm Lauren Bennett, and this is how one Christmas gift taught me the cost of love, forgiveness, and letting go. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Snow drifted past my window in slow, silent sheets, blurring the skyline of downtown Chicago into pale gray. I sat at my desk, still staring at the frozen reflection of my own face on the laptop screen. The last meeting of the year had just ended, a brutal hour of Derek Lawson taking credit for my entire campaign. The words still rang in my ears. Derek's leadership brought this project to life. I could almost hear the polite laughter, the tapping of keyboards, the virtual applause. No one said my name. When the meeting ended, I didn't move. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. The only sound in the apartment was the low hum of the heater. I opened my email, hoping stupidly that someone might have noticed. But there it was at the top of my inbox. Brightline Media congratulates Derek Lawson on the success of our holiday campaign. I shut the laptop. The silence pressed in. I turned on the radio, trying to fill the space. Nat King Cole's voice poured through the speakers, Chestnut's Christmas cheer, all that warmth that didn't exist here. My apartment was neat, minimal, too perfect. A small, fake tree sat in the corner, decorated with gold ribbons I bought last year, but never had time to take down. A few Christmas cards lined the windowsill. Co-workers, friends, the neighbors across the hall. None from Dad. It had been years since he'd sent one. Maybe he'd stopped when Mom died. Maybe he'd stopped caring altogether. I stood and crossed to the closet, pulling out a small box. Inside was the gift I'd bought for him every year, something practical, impersonal. This time a wool cardigan in dark navy. I'd even wrapped it neatly, labeled it for Dad, but as I looked at it now, it felt absurd, small, meaningless. I unwrapped it, folded it back into the box, and left it open on the table. My eyes caught the framed photo beside it, me maybe 10 years old in Dad's garage holding a little wooden truck. He was standing behind me, younger, stronger, smiling in that rare, tight-lipped way he used to. He'd built the truck himself. Back then, he worked 6 days a week as a mechanical engineer at the Ford plant, and he still came home smelling of oil and metal. I used to watch him fix things. Engines, radios, the washing machine, and believe there was nothing he couldn't repair. I picked up the photo. The glass was cold under my fingers. That was the last Christmas we'd spent as a real family before Mom got sick, before everything froze between us. I sat down staring at the picture until the details blurred. Dad loved trucks. He used to say you could tell everything about a man by the way he took care of his truck. After Mom died, that old Ford became the only thing he talked to. He'd polish it every weekend drive, nowhere in particular, and never let anyone else behind the wheel. Somewhere between then and now, I'd turned that memory into a promise one day. I'd make him proud. I opened my laptop again, typing Chevy Silverado 2023 into the search bar. Images of gleaming steel and chrome filled the screen. Strong, quiet, dependable. Exactly the kind of thing he'd admire. The reflection of the truck's metallic blue paint lit up my face in the dark room. A part of me knew it was ridiculous. A truck couldn't fix 20 years of silence. But the child inside me, the one still waiting for a good job or even a thanks, whispered. Maybe this time. I compared models, trims, towing packages. The Lariat edition looked perfect, luxury without being flashy. Practical. A man like my father wouldn't want anything that screamed for attention. I imagined his expression when he saw it. Surprise first, then pride. Maybe even a smile that reached his eyes. I clicked through reviews, scrolling endlessly, until the idea no longer felt impulsive, but inevitable. Before I could talk myself out of it, I picked up my phone and called the dealership in Dearborn. A man named Rick answered. Miller Chevrolet. This is Rick. Hi, Rick, I said, hearing my own voice tremble. I'm looking to purchase a Silverado as a gift. It's for my father. Great choice, he said. Any idea what color you're thinking? I hesitated, remembering Dad's old truck. Deep navy faded with time. Blue, I said finally. A strong one. Something classic. He chuckled. Blue steel or glacier? Metallic blue steel, I answered. And I want a red bow, big enough for him to see it from the carch. Rick laughed softly. That's a first. All right, we can make that happen. When's the big day? Christmas Eve, I said. It has to be ready by Christmas Eve. Done, he replied. We'll make sure it's perfect. I hung up and stared at the phone for a long time. The heater clicked off, leaving the room silent again. Outside, the snow had thickened, muffling the city below. The glow of streetlights turned everything silver. I walked to the window and pressed my palm to the glass, the cold biting through my skin. Somewhere in Michigan, my father was probably sitting alone in that house, watching the same kind of snowfall. Maybe this year will be different, I whispered. I turned off the lights, leaving only the small tree glowing behind me. On the counter, the half-wrapped cardigan sat next to a notepad, where I scribbled Chevy Silverado 2023, blue steel, Christmas Eve delivery. The hum of the city faded as I sat back down, tracing my fingers over the photo one more time. For a moment, I could almost smell the oil and sawdust, again hear the faint clink of Dad's tools. A part of me wanted to call him right then to say, Merry Christmas early, to test the waters, but another part, the one that still remembered the sting of his silence, stopped me. Instead, I whispered to the empty room, maybe a gift can speak louder than words ever did. The clock struck 10. I turned off my laptop and stood in the quiet, the faint hum of carols still drifting through the air. Snow kept falling soft and steady, burying the city in white. And somewhere between the music and the silence, the decision settled in my chest. Like a weight, this Christmas I'd go home. I was 12 the first time Dad took me to the Ford plant in Dearborn. It was Father-Daughter Day, though nothing about it felt like a celebration. The air inside the factory was thick with the smell of oil and hot metal. Machines thundered in rhythmic clanks, and every man on the floor seemed to move like clockwork, focused, expressionless, efficient. Dad walked ahead of me, safety goggles over his stern face, never glancing back to see if I could keep up. Stay close, he said, his voice barely audible over the noise. I nodded, even though he wasn't looking. I remember watching him work. His hands quick, precise, adjusting a piece of machinery, while other men hovered around waiting for his cue. They respected him. I could see it in the way they stepped aside when he spoke. That used to make me proud. I thought maybe if I learned enough, he'd look at me the same way he looked at an engine that finally ran right. At lunchtime, the factory cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee and cold fries. He sat across from me, reading blueprints spread out on the table while I unwrapped the peanut butter sandwich Mom had made for me that morning. You could have made her proud today, I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't look up. Your mother was always proud of you, he said, then added after a pause. She worried too much. That's all. Even back then I could feel the distance between us, the kind that no words could cross. Mom had been the warmth in that house. She sang while she baked old carols from her childhood, her voice carrying through the kitchen like sunlight. I used to stand on a chair beside her helping roll out cookie dough, laughing when flour covered my face. She'd smile and brush my hair from my eyes, saying, You have to keep your heart warm, sweetheart. Even when other people get cold, it wasn't until years later that I realized she wasn't talking about the weather. After she died, that warmth vanished. The house turned quiet, mechanical, like Dad himself. Dinner was quick. Conversation was shorter. I learned to speak less to fill the silence with achievements instead. Grades, trophies, scholarships, each one handed over like an offering he never asked for. Back in the present, I sat cross-legged on the living room rug, pulling a dusty photo album from the bottom shelf of the bookcase. The spine cracked when I opened it. There was Mom in her red apron dusted with flour, laughing at something I couldn't remember. There was Dad beside the old Ford truck, squinting against the sun, his arm around me, in the only picture where he ever looked at the camera. My fingers trembled as I traced the photo of the three of us together. The Christmas before Mom got sick. She looked so alive it hurt. I closed the album quickly and leaned back, staring at the ceiling, swallowing the ache in my throat. That same cardboard box sat on the shelf nearby. The small wooden one Mom had left for me when she died. The lid was carved with delicate vines, and across the top, in her soft handwriting, were the words, For Lauren, when you're ready, I'd kept it sealed for over 20 years. I reached for it now, setting it on my lap. The wood was smooth and cool under my palms. My thumb brushed the engraving as if touching her voice. Part of me wanted to open it to finally see what she had left behind, but my chest tightened, and I couldn't. Not yet. Not today, I whispered. My voice cracked a little. I placed it back carefully, almost reverently, as if any sudden move might break the spell. Outside, the sky had darkened to that deep winter blue that feels like evening. Even at 4 in the afternoon. I stood and poured myself a glass of water, catching my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked like her in moments like this. Same eyes, same way of hiding exhaustion behind a practiced calm. The clock on the microwave blinked 4:37. I opened my laptop again, pulling up my work email. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before typing, requesting personal leave, December 22, 26. Within minutes, a message popped up from Rachel, my assistant manager. "Everything okay?" "You never take time off," I typed back. "Just visiting family. It's been a while." Another message followed almost immediately. "Good for you, you deserve it." I smiled faintly and shut the laptop. Visiting family. It sounded simple enough written out, but it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. I sat on the couch picking up my phone. "The contact, Dad." Dearborn stared back at me. I hesitated, then hit call. It rang 3 times before he answered. "Thomas Bennett," he said as if it were a business call. "Hi, Dad. It's me. Lauren. Everything all right?" "Yes. Just wanted to check in." A pause. I could hear the faint hum of the television in the background. "Work keeping you busy?" he asked. "Always. That's good. You should stay focused. Don't let distractions pull you off track." I smiled bitterly. "Right. Of course. Well, good to hear from you," he said. "Take care." And then the click. Just like always. The call lasted 2 minutes and 47 seconds. I stared at the screen until it went dark. That hollow silence rushed back, filling every corner of the room. I leaned my head against the back of the couch and closed my eyes. For 20 years, we'd been having the same conversation, efficient, polite, empty. I told him I was fine, and he told me to keep working hard. He never asked the one thing that might have mattered. In the quiet, my thoughts whispered the question I'd been answering all along. "Are you happy, Lauren?" I opened my eyes, staring again at the snow gathering on the windowsill, the city lights flickering through it. Somewhere out there, miles away, my father was sitting in that same kind of silence. Maybe I thought this trip home wasn't about him seeing me. Maybe it was about me finally seeing the truth of who we'd both become. I turned off the lamp, letting the room fade into shadow. The only sound was the steady hum of the heater and the faint echo of my mother's voice, somewhere deep in memory telling me once more to keep my heart warm. The city was still asleep when I backed the Chevy out of the garage. 6 a.m., and Chicago looked like a watercolor painting. Gray skies, white streets, the lake in the distance, buried beneath a soft blur of fog. The engine hummed quietly, the heater pushing warm air against my frozen hands. I'd packed only one suitcase, a small box of cookies, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, this trip would end differently than all the others. The roads were empty tire tracks cutting clean paths through the snow. I adjusted the GPS toward Dearborn, Michigan. 3 hours, 40 minutes, the voice said. My breath fogged the windshield before the defroster cleared it. For a second, I wondered if I should have called ahead, warned him. But surprises were the only kind of risk I still knew how to take. Outside the city, the landscape shifted into white fields and distant barns. The rhythm of the wipers lulled me into a kind of trance. I thought about the last time I'd driven this way. December 2002. The funeral. The snow had fallen then too silent and relentless. I'd worn black gloves that were too big for me and carried a box of tissues I never used. Dad hadn't cried. He'd just stood beside the casket, one hand on the polished wood, his face unreadable. When I'd hugged him goodbye that night, he'd said, "Drive safe and nothing else." Not even, "Thank you for coming." The hum of the tires on asphalt pulled me back. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. 21 years later, and somehow that silence still had a pulse. A few hours in, I stopped for gas outside Kalamazoo. The air bit through my coat as I stepped out the pump handle, icy against my fingers. Inside the station, the smell of burnt coffee and cinnamon rolls clung to the air. I bought a large cup of black coffee and watched through the window as a young father and his little girl cleaned snow off their car. She laughed when he flicked a handful of snow at her, shrieking like it was the best thing in the world. He caught her in his arms, spinning her once before buckling her into the back seat. I smiled without meaning to, and then felt the sting of envy right after. The cashier, a teenage boy with sleepy eyes, handed me my change. "Traveling for the holidays?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Family?" He nodded like he'd heard 1,000 versions of that same answer. "Safe drive, ma'am." Back in the truck, the coffee burned my tongue. I turned the radio back on. Static, then Bing Crosby again. The same voice that had filled my apartment the night before. I let it play softly as I pulled back onto the highway, miles stretching out ahead like a blank page I wasn't sure I wanted to write on. Around noon, my phone buzzed on the console. Aunt Sarah's name flashed on the screen. "Hi, honey," she answered, her voice warm, familiar. "I didn't expect to hear from you today." "I'm driving to Michigan," I said, "to see Dad." There was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Does he know?" "No. I wanted it to be a surprise." "Oh, Lauren." She sighed. "You know how he is about surprises." "I know," I said quietly. "But I need to try." I could almost hear her smile through the phone. "Well, that's brave of you. Just remember, he's not good at showing things. Doesn't mean he doesn't feel them." I wanted to believe that. "Thanks, Aunt Sarah. I'll stop by after Christmas, okay?" "You better," she said. "And drive safe. The weather's bad up north." By the time I hit the Michigan state line, the sky had darkened again. A sign flashed past through the mist. "Welcome to Michigan." I whispered it out loud the way you do when you need to remind yourself that something's real. The roads narrowed into stretches of rural highway, tall trees bending under the weight of snow. Somewhere near Ann Arbor, a police checkpoint slowed traffic. I rolled down my window when the officer waved me forward. He leaned in a friendly face under his beanie. "Morning, ma'am. Routine holiday check. Roads are slick today." His badge read Paul Jensen. I handed over my license. "Morning, officer." "Yeah, it's a mess out there." His eyes shifted toward the passenger seat where the red bow I'd bought for the truck lay folded in plastic. "That's one big decoration. Somebody getting a surprise." I smiled. "My dad. I'm giving him this truck for Christmas." "Nice," he said, nodding toward the Silverado. "That's a hell of a gift. It's been a long time since I could give him something he actually wanted." He grinned. "Well, I hope he's the sentimental type. Some folks aren't great with surprises." I laughed softly. "He's complicated." "Most dads are," he said, stepping back. "Anyway, good luck, Ms. Bennett. Hope it goes better than you think." "Thanks," I said, pulling away. His words lingered longer than they should have. The snow picked up as I neared Dearborn. Streetlights blinked on one by one, casting long shadows across the white drifts. Houses appeared, rows of modest 2-story homes wrapped in Christmas lights, their windows glowing gold. Every driveway seemed to hold laughter motion color. Families unloading groceries, kids building snowmen. And then I turned onto my father's street. Oakwood Drive was quieter, older. The houses were spaced farther apart, the lights more subdued. When I pulled up to number 2245, my chest tightened. The siding was still the same faded blue. The old mailbox leaned at the same angle. Even the porch light, the one Mom used to turn on for me when I was late, was off. I parked at the curb, leaving the engine running. The red bow on the passenger seat caught the reflection of the headlights, glowing faintly like a warning light. I stared at the front window, curtains drawn. No movement, no Christmas tree in sight. I sat there for a long time, my fingers gripping the steering wheel, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Somewhere down the block, a car door slammed, and laughter echoed. I looked toward the sound. Another house, another family, another warmth that wasn't mine. I took a deep breath, reached for my coat, and shut off the engine. The air was cold enough to sting as I stepped out. The neighborhood smelled faintly of pine and chimney smoke. Snow crunched under my boots as I walked around to the back of the truck, brushing frost off the tailgate. For a moment, I ran my hand along the Chevy emblem, the metal icy against my skin. "This is it," I whispered. "This has to mean something." The headlights clicked off, leaving me in near darkness, except for the faint glow from the streetlight overhead. I could barely see the outline of Dad's house now. Just a shape in the snow, familiar and foreign all at once. My breath clouded in front of me. I tightened my scarf, started up the walkway, and stopped at the bottom of the steps. The windows were still dark. No tree, no music, no sign of life. I glanced back once at the truck, the bow sitting perfectly against the hood, a bright red promise in the snow. Then I looked at the door. It was time. I climbed the steps, my heart pounding, and raised my hand to knock. The wind had started to howl by the time I reached the front steps. Snow whipped against my face, stinging my cheeks, clinging to my hair. The house stood silent and dark, the porch light still burned out, just like it had been all those years ago. The red bow on the Silverado glowed faintly under the streetlight, bright against the white drift. For a second, it almost looked absurd, like a child's dream dropped into someone else's life. I held the small gift box in both hands and forced myself to breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. 3 soft knocks. The sound was swallowed by the wind. The door opened after what felt like forever. Dad stood there, tall but thinner than I remembered, his face marked by years that seemed to have settled in the lines around his eyes. His gray hair was neatly combed, his shirt buttoned all the way up like always. "Lauren." His voice carried a mix of disbelief and irritation. "What are you doing here?" "Hi, Dad," I said, trying to smile, though my lips were numb from the cold. "It's Christmas. I wanted to spend the evening with you." He frowned. "You should have called. I wanted it to be a surprise." For a brief moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes, confusion, maybe a hint of warmth, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He stepped aside just enough for the porch light from the street to fall across the driveway. His gaze caught on the truck. "What's that?" I turned to look, pretending I didn't already know. "Your gift," I said softly. "A Chevy Silverado. I know how much you've always liked them." He stared at it for a long time, his jaw tightening. The only sound was the wind pushing snow across the steps. "You bought that?" he asked finally, voice flat. I nodded. "It's yours. Merry Christmas." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. He let out a low breath, more like a scoff than a sigh. "You think buying me a truck changes anything?" My chest tightened. "No, it's not about changing anything. It's about showing you I still care." He looked at me then. Really looked at me. The disappointment in his eyes hit harder than the cold ever could. "You don't need to prove anything, and I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," I said quickly. "It's love, Dad. Just love." He shook his head almost to himself. "You should have saved your money." Before I could speak again, he took a step back. "Go home, Lauren. It's late." "Dad," but the door was already closing. "Dad, please, just..." The sound of the latch catching echoed like a gunshot. The porch light flickered from the wind and then went out, leaving me in darkness. I stood there frozen, staring at the grain of the door. My breath came out in short clouds. The box in my hands felt heavy and pointless. The world was silent except for the wind. Across the street, lights glowed in other houses. Warm, golden, alive. Laughter drifted faintly from somewhere down the block. I stepped back, staring at the truck, the ridiculous red bow now sagging under a thin layer of snow. My throat burned. I blinked hard, trying to push the tears back, but they came anyway, hot against my frozen skin. For a moment, I thought about knocking again, about yelling or crying or saying everything I'd wanted to say since I was 12, but the words wouldn't come. They never did with him. The door stayed closed. I didn't know how long I stood there, long enough for the snow to collect on my shoulders, to melt down the collar of my coat. My legs started to shake, so I turned toward the street. Each step felt heavier than the last. The crunch of boots on snow broke the silence. A voice called out behind me. "Honey, you okay?" I turned. A woman stood on the porch next door, wrapped in a long coat, her gray hair blowing across her face. Her house glowed with the soft yellow of Christmas lights. "I'm fine," I said automatically, forcing a small smile. My voice cracked. "Just a misunderstanding." She nodded slowly, studying me with kind eyes. "Well, if you need to warm up, I've got coffee on. House number 12. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. She gave me one last sympathetic look before stepping back inside. The sound of her door closing was softer than my father's, but somehow it hurt less. I looked down the street. Rows of houses glowing like memories of something I'd never had. The snow had started to fall harder again, covering the tire tracks I'd left behind. I wrapped my coat tighter and started walking, my boots sinking deep with every step. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look at the truck either. Somewhere in the distance, faint music carried through the cold, a carol from someone's radio, muffled but familiar. I'll be home for Christmas. The irony almost made me laugh. Almost. I shoved my hands in my pockets and kept walking, the cold air burning in my lungs. The street lamps blurred in the snow until everything, houses, lights, sky, faded into the same dull gray. By the time I reached the end of the block, the wind had picked up again, sweeping across my footprints until they disappeared completely. The porch light flickered on as I walked toward the house next door, snow crunching under my boots. My fingers were numb, my face stiff with windburn, and I had no idea what I was going to say. But before I could even knock, the door opened. The woman who stood there looked like warmth itself. Her gray hair was tucked neatly behind her ears, her cheeks pink from the heat inside. She wore a red cardigan that matched the glow of her house. The smell hit me first. Baked apples and cinnamon, the kind that makes you remember things you didn't realize you'd forgotten. "You poor thing," she said softly. "Come in before you freeze." I hesitated for half a second, then stepped inside. The door closed behind me, sealing out the wind. The shift in temperature made my skin prickle. The house was small but filled with life, soft yellow light, Bing Crosby crooning from a vintage radio, the hum of something baking in the oven. A small tree stood in the corner wrapped in simple gold tinsel. "Sit down, honey," she said, motioning to the armchair near the fireplace. "You look like you've had one hell of a night." I managed a tired smile. "You could say that." She poured me a cup of tea from a ceramic pot, the steam curling up like smoke. "I'm Evelyn," she said as she handed it over. "Number 12, Lauren." I said, wrapping my hands around the cup. The heat seeped into my fingers. She studied me for a moment, the kind of look that saw straight through politeness. "Your father lives next door, doesn't he?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Evelyn sighed softly, sitting down across from me. "He's a hard man. Always has been. I've lived here nearly 30 years, and I don't think I've ever seen him smile." That stung, though I wasn't surprised. "He wasn't always like that," I said quietly. She tilted her head. "No, I suppose not. People change when life kicks the air out of them." For a while, neither of us spoke. The fire popped in the hearth. The radio crackled faintly. I stared into the flames, my tea untouched, and tried to slow my breathing. After a moment, Evelyn spoke again, her voice lower this time. "My son used to live here with me. He was about your age when we had our last argument. I told him he was wasting his life. He told me I was controlling. He left that night, said he'd call when he cooled off. He never did." I looked up. Her eyes glistened, but she smiled anyway. "He died in a car accident 3 days later. I wrote him letters for years after that. Dozens of them. They filled a box I keep in the closet. He never got to read a single one." My chest tightened. "I'm so sorry." She nodded, eyes still on the fire. "You don't know how long you have to say the things that matter. But you can't force people to listen either. I learned that too late." We sat there in silence. I stared at the flames dancing behind the screen, the warmth pressing against my face. Evelyn turned to me again. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course. Stop trying to make people understand you," she said gently, "especially the ones who don't know how. Spend that energy understanding yourself instead." The words hit me harder than I expected. For years, my life had been built around trying to earn someone's approval, a father, a boss, even myself. The thought of not chasing that felt foreign. She smiled faintly, as if she could read the thought in my head. "You're not broken, sweetheart. Some people just don't have the language for love. Doesn't mean you have to speak their silence." I looked down at my hands, watching the steam from the tea fade away. "I just wanted him to see me," I whispered. Evelyn nodded slowly. "He does. Maybe not in the way you want, but he does. Sometimes love hides behind fear, and sometimes fear just looks like pride." Her words settled between us, quiet and heavy. She stood crossed to a small shelf and took down a framed photograph. It was of a young man in a baseball uniform, smiling wide. She placed it on the table in front of me. "That's my Michael," she said. "He was stubborn, just like his mother. I studied the picture. He looks kind. He was," she said, "but kindness can't fix everything. You can love someone and still lose them. You can forgive someone who will never ask for it, I nodded, feeling tears prick at my eyes again. I don't know how to forgive him, I admitted. Not after tonight. You don't have to wow yet, she said. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone else. It's the space you clear for yourself so you can breathe again. We sat quietly for a while. The clock on the wall ticked softly. The snow tapped at the windows like tiny knocks. I finally took a sip of the tea. It tasted faintly of honey and cloves. When the warmth started to reach my bones, I stood up. Thank you, I said. For the tea, for everything. She walked me to the door, her slippers silent on the wooden floor. Before I stepped outside, she reached for something on the entryway table, a small white envelope. Take this, she said, pressing it into my hand. Just a little reminder. I glanced down. In neat handwriting across the front were 3 words. You are enough. I looked up at her throat tightening. Thank you, I said again. Get some rest, Lauren, she replied. Tomorrow will make more sense. Outside, the snow had thickened again. The cold bit at my face as I crossed the yard back to my truck. Evelyn's house glowed behind me, warm and alive. My father's house stood next to it, dark, still unwelcoming. 2 worlds separated by a fence. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, the headlights carving narrow paths through the snow. 10 minutes later, I pulled into a small roadside inn near Belleville Lake. The sign read, Vacancy, the parking lot, almost empty. Inside, the clerk handed me a key with a half smile. Merry Christmas, he said. Yeah, I murmured. You too. The room smelled faintly of pine air freshener. I set my bag down, pulled the tie from my hair, and stared at my reflection in the mirror above the dresser. My mascara had smudged my eyes, swollen from cold and tears. I wiped my face, switched off the main light, and sat on the edge of the bed, watching the glow of red and green lights blinking from the street outside. For the first time all day, I exhaled. The sound of the heater filled the room. Maybe Dad would never change. Maybe he didn't know how. But as I looked at the note in my hand, those 3 quiet words, I wondered if maybe the change had to start with me. I turned off the lamp. The reflection of the blinking Christmas lights shimmered across the window pane, soft and blurred, as if the whole world were breathing again. The morning light barely made it through the thick blanket of snow on the motel window. The world outside looked muted, soft, as if wrapped in cotton. I sat up slowly, my body aching from the restless sleep, the memories of last night still pressing against my chest. The clock on the nightstand read 7:12. Christmas morning. For a moment I thought about staying there, ordering bad coffee, turning on the TV, pretending the day didn't matter. But something in me refused. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was hope refusing to die quietly. Either way, I found myself getting dressed, brushing the tangles out of my hair, and packing the small wooden box I'd brought from Chicago, the one I hadn't shown anyone in years. Inside was the little wooden truck my father had carved for me when I was 10. The paint was chipped now, the wheels scuffed, but it was the only thing we'd ever made together, the only piece of him I could carry that didn't hurt to touch. I wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with a red ribbon. Then I slid a small card underneath the string, Merry Christmas, Dad. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a wall. The air was sharp and still, the kind that made every breath visible. I started the truck and drove slowly through the quiet streets of Dearborn. The houses looked peaceful, their roofs heavy with snow wreaths sagging on doors. For once, even the world felt tired. When I turned onto Oakwood Drive, I saw movement in the driveway before I even parked. A woman was shoveling snow from the walkway, her long brown coat dusted with white flakes. It took me a second to realize who she was. Nancy Coleman, Dad's girlfriend. She looked up surprised when she recognized me. Lauren, I didn't know you were still in town. I smiled faintly and stepped out of the truck, clutching the small box in my hands. Just for a bit. I wanted to drop something off. She leaned on the shovel, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. He doesn't know you're here, does he? No, I said. And that's fine. I'm not here to talk. Just to leave this. I walked up to the porch, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The house looked the same as it had last night, dim windows, quiet, as if holding its breath. Nancy followed a few steps behind me. He's been sitting by the window all morning, she said softly. Didn't sleep much. He just keeps staring at that truck like it's some kind of ghost. I paused at the steps, glancing toward the driveway where the Silverado stood, gleaming blue under a fresh dusting of snow. Does he regret what he said? Nancy hesitated. He regrets everything. He just doesn't know how to start. I nodded slowly, setting the small box on the porch table beside the door. The card caught a stray gust of wind and fluttered before settling again. If he wants to talk, he will. But this is enough for me. She looked at me, her expression softening. You really are his daughter. Both of you wear your pride like armor. I gave a small laugh. Yeah, maybe that's the problem. Through the front window, I caught the faintest movement, a shadow behind the curtain. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he was there watching. I didn't wave. I didn't knock. I just stood there for a moment, letting the cold bite into my fingers until I couldn't feel them anymore. Then I turned back to Nancy. Tell him Merry Christmas for me. She nodded. I will. I smiled, the kind that felt both sad and freeing. Thank you. The drive out of the neighborhood was slow. The snow had started falling again, heavy and wet, turning the world white all over. My wipers squeaked across the windshield. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed faintly. When I reached the main road, I felt my phone buzz in the cup holder. I ignored it at first, assuming it was another holiday ad or maybe Aunt Sarah checking in. But when it rang again, I glanced down. The caller ID read, Dearborn Police Department. My heart tightened. I pulled onto the shoulder, the tires crunching over packed snow, and answered, Hello, Ms. Bennett. The voice was calm male. I recognized it instantly. Officer Paul Jensen, the same one from the checkpoint yesterday? Yes, I said already. Uneasy. Is something wrong? Could you come by the station when you have a moment? His tone was measured professional. Of course. What's this about? It's regarding a vehicle. The Chevy Silverado registered under your name. I froze. The truck. What about it? I'd rather explain in person, ma'am. It's nothing dangerous, just some confusion we need to clear up. The air in the cab suddenly felt thinner. Okay, I said, my voice quieter now. I'll be there soon. Thank you, Ms. Bennett. We'll see you shortly. The line went dead. I sat there staring at the phone in my lap, my breath fogging the windshield. The road ahead blurred into white snowflakes, swirling like static. Confusion twisted in my stomach, giving way to dread. I thought of Nancy's words. He's been staring at that truck all morning. Something about the way she said it had felt off, but I couldn't explain why. The silence inside the truck was suffocating. I turned the ignition, the engine rumbling to life, but my hands wouldn't move. Outside, the snow kept falling harder, burying the tracks I'd left behind. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and finally pulled back onto the road, heading toward the police station. The phone screen dimmed on the passenger seat, the faint blue glow flickering against my hand. Whatever this was, I had the sinking feeling it wasn't going to be simple. The police station smelled faintly of old coffee and wet wool. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow on the metal table in front of me. My coat was still damp from the snow, the melting flakes forming dark patches on my sleeves. Officer Paul Jensen sat across from me, kind as ever, but his expression was serious this time. Ms. Bennett, he began, offering a polite nod. Thanks for coming in so quickly. Of course, I said, my voice tight. Can you tell me what this is about? He exhaled through his nose and opened a thin manila folder. Your father came in early this morning to report a stolen vehicle, a blue Chevy Silverado. For a second, the words didn't register. He what? Filed a theft report. Paul continued. Said the truck went missing overnight from his driveway. I stared at him, the disbelief giving way to something sharp and bitter. That truck is mine, I said slowly. Registered, financed, paid for. Mine. He nodded, sliding a document toward me. That's what I thought. I checked the system before calling you in. The registration lists you as the sole owner. Lauren Grace Bennett. I leaned forward, scanning the page even though I didn't need to. My name was right there in black and white. I almost laughed. He must have known that. I gave him the paperwork with the keys. Paul hesitated, then glanced toward the door. Would you mind if we brought him in to clear this up? My pulse quickened. He's here. Yeah, he said gently. Came in about an hour ago. The door opened before I could respond. The familiar sound of heavy footsteps filled the room. And then he was there. My father. His coat was unbuttoned, his gray hair uncombed, his face red from the cold, and maybe from anger. He stopped short when he saw me. Lauren, he said, his voice tight. Dad, I forced the word out. It tasted strange now. Paul stood, clearing his throat. Mr. Bennett, we just need to go over the ownership details one more time. There's been a misunderstanding. My father's eyes darted from me to the folder on the table. I don't understand, he said. That truck was in my driveway last night. This morning it was gone. I folded my arms. Because I took it back. His jaw clenched. You what? I kept my voice calm even though my hands were shaking. You told me you didn't want it. You said it was pity. So I took it back to the dealership. It's not yours, Dad. It never was. The room went still. Paul cleared his throat softly. Sir, I've confirmed the title. The vehicle belongs to Ms. Bennett. There's no theft here. Just a mix-up. My father's face flushed a deeper red. I thought... He stopped, swallowing hard. I assumed she'd signed it over. She didn't. Paul said it evenly. So there's no case. I'll mark the report as withdrawn. Dad's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just thought maybe... He trailed off. I looked at him waiting, but he didn't finish the sentence. His hand tightened around the brim of his cap until it bent. Paul closed the folder and stood. I'll give you two a moment, he said, stepping out into the hallway. Through the open door, I caught a glimpse of Nancy standing outside, arms crossed, watching everything through the glass. Her face was pale, disappointed. The door clicked shut behind him. The silence that followed felt heavier than the cold air outside. You called the police on me, I said quietly. He rubbed his forehead. I thought someone stole it. I didn't know. You didn't think to call me first. His shoulders stiffened. You left without saying a word. I laughed bitterly. You slammed a door in my face, Dad. He didn't respond. His eyes dropped to the table. I reached for the keys that Paul had left beside the folder. The metal was cold in my palm. I stood, slipping them into my pocket. Merry Christmas, Dad, I said softly. He looked up, his eyes tired, lined, uncertain. Lauren, wait. I'd paused at the door. You didn't lose your truck. I said, my voice steady. But you did lose something else. He flinched slightly, like the words had landed harder than I intended. His fingers worked nervously against the brim of his hat, bending it out of shape. I'm sorry, he said, but it came out so faintly I almost missed it. I opened the door. Nancy stepped aside as I passed, her gaze shifting from him to me, her lips pressed tight as if she wanted to say something but knew it wasn't her place. Paul was waiting by the front desk, filling out paperwork. When he saw me, he offered a small, sympathetic smile. All sorted. Yeah, I said, pulling my coat tighter. Thanks for the call. He nodded. Families can be messy. Happens more than you'd think. I believe that, I murmured. As I stepped out into the cold, the sun was just breaking through the clouds, weak but steady, glinting off the layer of ice on the parking lot. The air smelled faintly of salt and snow. Paul followed me to the door. Merry Christmas, Ms. Bennett, he said quietly. I looked back, the wind tugging at my hair. You too, Officer Jensen. Then I turned and walked toward my truck. The keys jingled softly in my pocket with every step. Behind me, the glass doors swung shut, cutting off the sound of the station. The voices, the hum, the endless noise of explanations that never fixed anything. The world outside was blinding white, and for the first time all day I felt completely, irreversibly done. By the time I walked back into the Brightline media offices, Chicago had thawed just enough for the streets to glisten with slush. The building's glass doors reflected a version of me I barely recognized. Composed, sharp eyes, steady. I'd spent the past 3 days trying not to think about Michigan, or the look on my father's face in that fluorescent-lit room. But grief has a way of following you even into corporate hallways that smell like burnt coffee and ambition. The Monday after Christmas always felt wrong, like the city hadn't decided whether to wake up yet. Inside, the office buzzed with forced cheer. New planners' resolutions, fake smiles. I took the elevator up to the 5th floor, coffee in hand, ignoring the leftover tinsel someone had taped to the walls. When I stepped into the conference room, the meeting was already underway. Derek Lawson stood at the front, sleeves rolled up, pointer in hand, his voice carrying that performative confidence people mistake for leadership. And this approach to consumer psychology is what gave our campaign its emotional edge, he said, pacing slowly. The large screen behind him showed my presentation slides. Every layout, every phrase, every color palette I'd spent months perfecting. The CEO, Barbara Reeves, nodded approvingly. Impressive work, Derek. This campaign's been our most successful in years. I took my usual seat at the far end of the table. My colleagues barely glanced at me. They didn't need to. Everyone knew whose work it really was. Derek clicked to the next slide, smiling like a man who'd just been handed the keys to the kingdom. I really wanted to lean into authenticity this quarter. Show the audience we understand what they're feeling. I stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly. For a moment, anger rose up. Sharp, electric, but then Evelyn's voice drifted through my memory. Sometimes silence is power, so I said nothing. When the meeting ended, Barbara clapped Derek on the back. Fantastic, truly. Let's talk about your bonus after the new year. Thank you, Barbara, he said. Just doing my job. I stood adjusting my blazer and waited until most people had left the room. Then, with a calm that surprised even me, I said, Great presentation. Derek, he turned, grinning. Thanks, Lauren. Couldn't have done it without your help early on. Of course, I said smoothly. I'll be sending the executive team all the original drafts and time logs later today, just so everything's properly archived. His grin faltered. That's not necessary. Oh, it is, I said lightly. We wouldn't want to lose track of who contributed what. You know how compliance is. His Adam's apple bobbed. Right, sure. Thanks. I smiled, picked up my coffee, and walked out. My heels echoed down the corridor, measured, deliberate, almost musical. Back at my desk, I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder labeled Brightline Holiday Campaign, Original Assets. Every file had a timestamp. Every draft carried my initials. I attached them all to a single email addressed to the executive board with the subject line, Documentation of Campaign Authorship. It took exactly 2 minutes to send. Then I sat back, sipping my coffee, and watched the snow fall outside the window. Thick and slow, like forgiveness refusing to come. 2 days later, whispers started. A few curious glances in the break room. Then an email from HR marked confidential. By the end of the week, word spread that Derek had been placed on administrative leave pending internal investigation. No one asked me a thing. No one needed to. That Friday afternoon, Barbara stopped by my office, her tone careful but approving. Lauren, thank you for forwarding those documents. It's important that credit is given where it's due. I nodded. Of course. She hesitated, then smiled. You're a class act. You know that I returned the smile, but said nothing. She left before I could feel anything other than tired. That evening, the office emptied out early. I stayed behind, finishing reports, watching the light fade into gray. When the last person left, I closed my laptop and leaned against the window. The city below shimmered faintly through the fog. I lifted my coffee mug, now cold, and whispered to no one. You don't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes the truth does the talking. Across the miles, I imagined another silence unfolding in Michigan. My father sat in that living room, surrounded by memories he'd chosen not to touch for years. I could picture it perfectly. The old recliner near the window, the faint hum of the furnace, the empty space in the driveway where the Silverado had stood. Nancy was packing a suitcase. I can't do this anymore, Thomas, she said softly, folding a sweater into the bag. You push everyone away, even the people trying to love you. He didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the frost forming along the window pane. She zipped the bag and placed it by the door. You didn't just lose your daughter. You're losing yourself. The only sound in the room was the wind pressing against the house, rattling the blinds. Nancy stood there a moment longer, waiting for him to say something, anything. But he didn't. When she finally walked out, the cold swept in through the open door before it clicked shut again. He sat there long after she was gone, his hands clasped, staring at the empty driveway. The snow outside swirled in slow circles under the streetlight, settling where the truck had once been. In 2 different cities, we both sat in silence. Mine was calm, earned steady, the kind that holds its head high. His was hollow, heavy, echoing with everything that had gone unsaid. Sometimes silence means peace, and sometimes it's just regret, wearing a quiet face. The first Monday of the new year brought with it a kind of gray that seeped into everything. Streets, windows, mood. The city still wore its winter hush, all soft edges and salt-stained sidewalks. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. No one ever came by this early. When I opened the door, a small cardboard box sat on the mat, dusted with snow. The return label said Sarah Collins, Dearborn M.I. My chest tightened. Aunt Sarah hadn't sent me anything in years. I brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen counter. The box was light, rattling faintly when I lifted it. A note was taped to the top in her neat handwriting. Found this while cleaning your mom's things. Thought it was time you had it. For a long moment, I just stood there staring at it, feeling something in my chest shift. An ache, slow and familiar. Then I reached for the scissors and sliced through the tape. Inside was a wooden box, the kind you'd find in an antique shop, worn smooth with age. I recognized it instantly. Mom's box. The same one she'd kept on her dresser all those years ago, carved with vines and flowers, the inscription etched across the lid. For Lauren when you're ready. I'd seen it 1,000 times as a kid, always wondering what was inside. When she died, Aunt Sarah told me it was meant for me. I'd been too afraid to open it back then. I wasn't sure I was brave enough now. I sat down by the window, the gray light spilling across the table. My hands shook a little as I lifted the latch. The hinges creaked softly. Inside was a single, folded letter, yellowed at the edges, tied with a faded ribbon. My name was written on the front, in my mother's graceful handwriting. Lauren Grace. The ribbon slipped off easily. I unfolded the letter carefully, afraid the paper might tear. Dear Lauren, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And you're old enough to understand that love doesn't always stay the way we wish it would. I hope you remember me laughing in the kitchen, singing off key, making a mess of the frosting. I hope you remember warmth, not the sickness, not the way I left. My throat tightened. The handwriting blurred for a second before I blinked the tears away. There will come a time when you'll have to work for someone's love, and it will feel like the only way to be worthy is to try harder. If that day ever comes, stop. The people who truly love you will never make you prove it. I let out a sound I didn't recognize, half sob, half laugh, the kind of sound that comes from too much truth. You have your father's strength, but please, my sweet girl, don't let his silence teach you how to disappear. Keep your heart warm. Let yourself be soft. You will be loved even when you don't see it. The last line read simply, with all my love, always. Mom. I sat there for a long time reading the letter over and over until the ink imprinted itself in my mind. My tears fell onto the page, bleeding tiny gray circles into her words. Outside, the world was still. The snow fell again, slow and deliberate, as if even time was holding its breath. I thought of her. Her laugh, her hands dusted with flour the way she used to hum when she cooked. I thought of Dad in the garage, silent. Distant, the smell of oil and metal thick in the air. And I thought of the space between them, the space I'd grown up inside, half warmth, half cold. After a while, I stood and put on my coat. I didn't bother to wipe the tears from my face. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into the box, and carried it with me to the car. Belleville Lake wasn't far, a 30-minute drive southwest. Mom used to take me there on summer afternoons, spreading out a blanket on the grass while Dad fished near the dock. I hadn't been back in years. When I arrived, the lake was frozen, a white sheet stretching out beneath the dull winter sun. The trees stood bare and quiet. No one else was there. I walked until I reached the old wooden bench overlooking the water. It was half buried in snow, but I brushed it off and sat down. The cold bit through my jeans, but I didn't care. I held the box in my lap, the letter still warm from my hands. Mom, I whispered. I think I'm ready now. The wind stirred gently, sweeping snow across the lake's surface. I opened the box again, tracing the carved vines with my fingertips. You were right, I said softly. I tried so hard to earn something that should have been given freely. I kept thinking if I just did more, worked harder, loved harder, he'd see me. The sound of my own voice broke something open inside me. I took a shaky breath. But I see it now. He can't give what he never learned to say, and maybe that's not my job to fix anymore. I set the letter on the bench beside me, weighed down by a small stone so it wouldn't blow away. For a while I just sobbed there, staring out at the frozen lake, letting the cold sting my cheeks. The wind picked up, scattering a few flakes into the air. The sunlight hit them just right, and for a second they looked like tiny stars dancing across the ice. I closed my eyes, hearing her voice, as clear as if she were sitting next to me. Keep your heart warm, sweetheart. Even when others get cold. When I finally stood, I felt lighter. Not happy, not yet, but unburdened in a way I hadn't been since I was a child. I tucked the letter back into the box, pressed my lips against the lid, and whispered, Thank you. Then I walked back toward the car, my boots leaving faint impressions in the snow. As I drove away, the lake disappeared in the rearview mirror, the horizon bleeding gold through the winter haze. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I felt like I was heading toward it. Snow fell in slow, quiet spirals over Dearborn that Christmas Eve. Through the frosted windows of the community center, the light was warm, steady, and soft. Inside, a dozen people sat in a loose circle of folding chairs, paper cups of coffee steaming in their hands. A banner hung crookedly on the wall. Healing for loss. You are not alone. My father sat among them. His posture rigid at first, like a man unused to sitting still in front of strangers. His coat hung on the back of his chair, and his hands rested on his knees. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated. His voice was quieter than I remembered, gravel worn smooth. "I've been coming here for about 6 months now," he began. "Mostly I listen. I'm not good with this." He made a small gesture toward the circle. "Talking." A few people nodded, smiling knowingly. He took a breath. "I lost my wife 22 years ago. Cancer. I told myself the best way to survive it was to stay busy, to keep everything running, you know, workhouse bills. What I didn't see was that I was losing something else in the process." He paused, rubbing a hand across his chin. "My daughter. She was 12 when her mother died. Smart kid. Kind. She needed warmth, and I gave her structure. She needed love, and I gave her rules." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the heater. "I thought I was teaching her how to be strong," he said softly. "Turns out I was just teaching her how to live without me," someone murmured. "That's brave to admit," he nodded. "It took me a long time to realize it. Too long. Last year she came home for Christmas. Brought me a gift I didn't deserve. A Chevy truck." A few people chuckled, and he smiled faintly. "I didn't take it well. I hurt her. And she walked away. I thought she was gone for good." He looked down, his voice catching slightly. "But I'm still here, and I'm trying to do better. I just hope it's not too late to tell her I'm proud of her." The facilitator, a gentle woman with kind eyes, gave a small nod. "Sometimes the hardest thing to repair is the silence we built ourselves," she said. He gave a small, grateful smile. "Yeah, that sounds about right." When the session ended, he stood slowly, thanked everyone, and walked out into the snow. The streetlights glowed amber against the white drifts, and his breath rose in pale clouds. At home, the house looked almost the same as it always had. Same blue siding, same leaning mailbox. But inside, there were small differences. The old family photo, once buried in a drawer, now sat on the living room table. The worn armchair had been moved closer to the window. On the mantel, a simple Christmas card rested in a silver frame, the one I'd left the year before. He plugged in the string of lights that wound around the old tree, half of them still flickering weakly. Then he took my card down from the mantel and hung it near the top branch. For the first time in a long time, he stood back and really looked at it. A knock at the door made him turn. It was Evelyn from next door, bundled in her red scarf, a small box in her hands. "Brought you coffee and pie," she said with a smile. "You didn't have to do that," he said, stepping aside. "I know. That's why I did." He took the box from her and set it on the counter. The smell of apple and cinnamon filled the air. "You decorating?" she asked, glancing at the tree. "Trying," he said. Her eyes softened. "That's more than you were doing last year." He gave a small laugh. "Guess that's something." She studied him for a moment, then said quietly, "Don't let her wait another 20 years. Thomas, if you're sorry, tell her. You don't get endless chances." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know." When she left, the house felt both emptier and lighter. He stood at the window for a long time, the pie cooling on the counter, the snow falling thicker now. He thought of the box, still tucked in his closet. His wife's old things, the letters he'd never read, the ones she'd written during her last months. He'd tried once, but couldn't finish. Maybe soon, he thought. Maybe after he saw Lauren. He looked at the clock. Nearly 9 p.m. He walked to his desk, sat down and opened his laptop. The screen glowed faintly against the dark room. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for several seconds before he began to type. Subject: "If you're ready, Lauren. I've made a lot of mistakes. Some I can name, most I can't. But I'm learning, slowly, that being sorry means more than just saying it. I'd like to see you. No gifts, no surprises. Just us. If you're ready, come home." He read it twice before pressing send. Then he closed the laptop and sat there in the glow of the Christmas lights. The house filled with a quiet that for once didn't hurt. Hundreds of miles away in Chicago, I was wrapping up a client call from my new office. The nameplate on my door read Lauren Bennett, marketing consultant. The company had changed leadership after the scandal. Brightline now hired me as an outside contractor. Life had shifted in subtle ways, steadier, freer. Great work, as always. Lauren Jason Miller said as the meeting ended. He lingered on the video call, smiling. You should come to the Christmas party tonight. Everyone would love to see you. I shook my head with a small smile. Maybe next year. I have somewhere I need to be. Somewhere better than free champagne, he teased. Something like that, I said. When the call ended, I sat back in my chair. Outside, the city glowed faintly through a swirl of snow. My inbox pinged. One new email, from Thomas Bennett. The subject line made my heart stop for a beat. If you're ready, I clicked it open, reading each word slowly. By the time I reached the end, my hands were trembling. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the message. The snow outside blurred into a white haze soft against the window pane. Finally, I opened a reply window. My fingers hovered over the keys, unsure, nervous, but something deeper, something like peace, settled inside me. I'll come. I hit send before I could change my mind. The screen glowed briefly, then went still. I leaned back in my chair, watching the Christmas lights outside blink against the skyline. My reflection stared back at me, older, calmer, a little less afraid. Maybe after all this time it really was possible to open a door that had been closed too long. The snow kept falling slow and quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for morning. The drive through Michigan felt endless. The sky caught between dusk and snow. The roads shimmered under the last streaks of daylight, the headlights from my truck cutting narrow paths through the frozen air. Christmas Eve again, a year since the night that had split something open inside me. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel as familiar road signs appeared. Ann Arbor, then Ypsilanti, then finally the turn toward Dearborn. By the time I reached Oakwood Drive, the sun was gone. The street was quiet, blanketed in snow. Houses glowed with Christmas lights, a patchwork of color against the dark. When I pulled up in front of my father's house, my breath caught. It looked the same, yet somehow different, less lonely maybe. The porch light was on. The smoke from the chimney rose in a thin, steady ribbon curling into the sky. He was already waiting. Thomas Bennett stood on the porch, wearing a worn flannel shirt. No coat, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands. His hair was grayer, thinner, but his face was softer. Less armor, more human. I turned off the engine, letting the silence settle before opening the door. The cold hit instantly sharp and clean. My breath hung between us like smoke. Dad, Lauren. The sound of our names filled the space between us, fragile but real. For a moment, neither of us moved. It felt like time had stopped, like the world was waiting to see who would step forward first. Finally, he did. He nodded toward the house. Come inside. You'll freeze out here. I followed him through the door, the warmth wrapping around me like a memory. The smell of pine and coffee filled the air. The house was tidier than I'd ever seen it. The furniture had been rearranged, a soft blanket thrown over the armchair. On the table sat something that made me stop. A wooden model truck. It was painted a deep metallic blue, the same color as the Silverado I'd bought him 2 Christmases ago. Every detail was exact, from the curved fenders to the small Chevy emblem carved into the front. I walked closer, running a hand over the smooth surface. You made this. He nodded, setting his mug down. Took me a few months. I wanted it to look right. It does. I said, my throat tightening. It's beautiful. He smiled faintly. I wanted to remember what it meant. That night when you showed up with that truck, I thought you were trying to buy something back. I told myself you were trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. But I was wrong. I turned toward him. You weren't the only one who thought that. He shook his head. No. I was the one who made you believe love had to be earned. I thought I was teaching you strength. All I did was teach you distance. I didn't realize I was crying until he stepped closer. His eyes for once didn't look through me. They saw me. You don't have to say you're sorry, I whispered. I just needed you to see me. He swallowed hard, his voice rough. I do. For the first time, I really do. The lights from the Christmas tree flickered across the room, casting soft patterns on the walls. For the first time in 20 years. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of things finally understood. He gestured to the couch. Sit. I made dinner. Nothing fancy. The table was set with 2 plates, a roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and the pie. Evelyn must have baked. I smiled faintly. You cooked? He chuckled. Evelyn supervised. I did the heavy lifting. Looks good, I said, pulling off my gloves. We sat across from each other, awkward at first, the clink of silverware too loud in the quiet house. But then he asked about my work, and I told him about my consulting clients, about how Brightline had changed. I mentioned Jason, my new collaborator, and the projects we'd launched. He listened. Really listened. That sounds like something your mother would have loved, he said. She always said you'd do big things. Hearing him say her name out loud made my chest ache in the best way. I found one of her letters, I said softly. The one she left for me. He looked down at his plate. I know. Sarah told me. I've been reading the ones she left for me, too. That made me pause. You kept them. He nodded. All of them. Couldn't open them for years. But when Nancy left, I realized I couldn't keep hiding from ghosts. The silence stretched again. But this time it felt like breathing. Like healing. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, filling the space with amber light. He walked over to the shelf and picked up the wooden truck again, turning it in his hands. You know, he said when I was carving this, I kept thinking about how something can be broken, and still worth repairing. It just takes patience. I smiled through tears I didn't bother to wipe away. You finally learned what Mom tried to teach us both. He met my eyes. She was the heart. I was just the structure. And I spent 20 years trying to fill the space between, I said. He nodded slowly. Then maybe tonight we close that space for good. He stepped closer, hesitating only a moment before placing his hand on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it carried 20 years of silence, pride, and regret. I'm proud of you, Lauren, he said quietly. Not for what you've done, for who you are. My breath caught, and I let out a soft laugh, shaky but real. You have no idea how long I've waited to hear that. I know, he said. And I'm sorry it took me this long. We stood there like that 2 people finally meeting in the middle of a life that had pulled them apart. The tree lights shimmered behind us, reflecting in the glass of the framed photo on the table. The 3 of us long ago frozen in time, but somehow still here. For the first time since I was a little girl, I leaned forward and hugged my father. His arms tightened around me, hesitant at first, then sure. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and silent, blanketing the world in white. Inside, for once, there was warmth. When we finally pulled apart, he looked at me with that small, almost disbelieving smile. You'll stay the night. I nodded. Yeah, I'd like that. He exhaled relief, softening his features. Good. There's coffee in the morning. I laughed, wiping my eyes. Some things never change. He smiled. Some things do. As he turned to stoke the fire, I glanced once more at the model truck on the table, its blue paint glinting under the lights. For years I had thought the door between us had closed for good, but standing there in the quiet glow of home, I realized it had just been waiting for both of us to find the courage to open it again. Dinner was simple, but perfect. The kind of meal that didn't need to impress anyone. The smell of roasted chicken filled the house, mingling with cinnamon from the apple pie cooling on the counter. A few candles flickered on the table, their light soft and uneven, catching the faint shimmer of snow outside the window. Dad poured 2 glasses of wine and sat down across from me. For a while we ate quietly, the kind of silence that felt comfortable for once. The years of tension of unsaid words seemed to melt away with each shared look, each unforced breath. This chicken's really good, I said, cutting a small piece. He smiled faintly. Evelyn made most of it. I supervised. Of course you did. That made him laugh. A low, surprised sound that felt strange but wonderful. Guess I don't have much practice cooking for 2. Well, I said, smiling back, neither do I. We ate slowly, the conversation unfolding in easy layers. We talked about work, about the changes in Dearborn, about how he'd finally replaced the leaky roof. But then the words began to shift, drifting toward memories we'd both avoided for years. He set his fork down, his tone softening. Do you remember how your mother used to burn the first batch of cookies every Christmas? I laughed. Every year. She'd blame the oven, but it was always because she got distracted singing along to Bing Crosby. She had the worst timing, he said with a fond smile. I used to tease her about it, and she'd say, "It's not Christmas until something goes wrong in the kitchen." I looked at him for a long moment. She was the warmth in this house. He nodded, his eyes distant. After she died, I thought I had to be strong. For you, for myself. I thought showing emotion would make things worse. It didn't, I said gently. It just made things colder. He let out a shaky breath. Yeah, I see that now. He leaned back, staring into his wineglass. I wasn't strong, Lauren. I was scared. I thought if I let myself feel too much, I'd break and never come back. I reached across the table and took his hand. I know, I said softly. I've been scared, too. I kept thinking, if I worked harder, did better, made people proud, I could fill the space she left behind. He squeezed my hand. We both tried to survive her loss by pretending we didn't need love. Turns out that's the one thing we couldn't live without. The words settled in the air, quiet and heavy, but not painful, just true. When we finished dinner, we carried our plates to the sink. He poured us more wine, and we moved to the living room. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The Christmas tree lights reflected off the windows, blinking softly in rhythm with the wind outside. Dad disappeared into the hallway and returned with a small box in his hands. He set it on the coffee table in front of me. What's this? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Open it, he said. His voice careful but warm. The box was simple, unwrapped, just tied with twine. Inside was a set of car keys. Chevy, of course. The metal caught the firelight and glinted faintly. I lifted them slowly, feeling the familiar weight in my palm. Then I noticed the engraving on the keychain. To my daughter. You were always enough. I stared at the words, unable to speak. My eyes stung. He smiled softly. It's not a truck, just a keychain. I saw it at the dealer when I went to get my oil changed. Thought maybe it was time to say what I should have said a long time ago. Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. I set the keys down carefully and reached for his hand again, shaking my head. I don't need anything, Dad. I just needed you to say that. He nodded, eyes glassy. I know. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, the firelight flickering across our faces, the quiet hum of the world outside, wrapping around us like a blanket. After a while, he leaned back and exhaled. You know your mom always believed that love finds its way back no matter how lost it gets. She was right, I said, smiling through tears. It just took a few wrong turns. We sat together until the candles burned low, trading stories about her. Her garden, her terrible handwriting, the way she'd hum whenever she was thinking. For the first time in decades, it felt like she was in the room with us. Part of the conversation instead of the silence. Later, we moved to the couch near the tree. I curled my legs beneath me while he stirred the fire. The soft glow of the lights danced on the walls, and I could hear the faint whistle of wind outside. When he sat down beside me, he looked around the room and smiled. You know, he said quietly, for a long time I thought Christmas was just a reminder of everything I'd lost, but this year it feels different. Because you let someone in again, I said. Because you came home, he answered. I smiled, leaning my head on his shoulder. The warmth between us wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, quiet, earned. For a long time, neither of us moved. The fire crackled softly, the tree lights blinking like tiny heartbeats. Outside, the snow had started again, flakes drifting past the window, catching the reflection of the lights inside. As I watched them fall, my thoughts turned inward, gentle and clear. Sometimes it takes a door closing for another to open. Sometimes you have to lose your way home before you find it again. That Christmas, I didn't bring a truck or a gift wrapped in ribbons. I brought something better. My heart finally unguarded. Dad's breathing evened out beside me, slow and calm, the kind of peace that comes only after a long storm. I smiled, letting the warmth of the fire wash over us both. The wooden model truck sat on the table across the room, its blue paint glowing softly in the firelight, a quiet symbol of everything we'd repaired. Not perfectly, but enough. And as the night deepened and the snow piled high outside, I thought about the strange ways love finds its way back through cracks we once thought permanent. Maybe forgiveness isn't a grand gesture. Maybe it's just sitting beside someone sharing silence and realizing the ache has finally softened into something like peace. Have you ever tried to heal a broken bond during the holidays? Share your story below. And remember, some doors close to let light in.